first light of dawn did not bring hope. It revealed a nightmare. 150 men sat on horses, forming a perfect silent circle around the perimeter of Elias Vance's dying farm. They were not cavalry. They were something worse. They were hunters. Their clothes were rough, their faces hard and unreadable, and every single one of them held a weapon, rifles, shotguns, pistols, knives, all pointed inward, all pointed at him. Elias stood frozen in the doorway of his crumbling cabin. The chill of the morning, nothing compared to the ice forming in his veins. This wasn't a warning. This was a verdict, and he knew, with a certainty that felt like a final heartbeat, the crime for which he was being sentenced. The woman. The woman he had found last night, half dead from hunger and cold. The woman to whom he had given his last loaf of bread. The woman now sleeping inside, her son curled beside her, both of them unaware that the world had just ended outside their temporary sanctuary. At the head of this army of thugs sat a man Elias had only ever seen from a distance, a man whose name was spoken in whispers, Jared Silas. He wasn't a large man, but he radiated a cold, absolute authority that made the 149 other armed men seem like mere extensions of his will. He held no weapon. He didn't need to. His gaze, locked on Elias, was a physical weight. Silas raised a single, gloved hand. In response, the sound of 150 hammers being cocked back tore through the morning silence. A single, unified, metallic snap that was more terrifying than any war cry. The message was absolute. There would be no discussion. There would be no negotiation. Elias Vance had trespassed against Jared Silas, and for that, he was already dead. Flashback 10 hours earlier. The storm was the final nail in the coffin of Elias Vance's life. For 3 years, he had fought a losing war against the dust, the debt, and the decaying memory of his wife, Sarah. This farm had been her dream. Every gnarled fence post, every warped floorboard in the cabin held the ghost of her laughter. Now it was a monument to his failure. The fields that were supposed to bloom with wheat were choked with invasive, thorny brush. The barn roof sagged like a broken spine. He was 38 years old, but he moved with the weary shuffle of a man twice his age. His soul as eroded as the topsoil. He fought against the wind and lashing rain now, his muscles screaming as he tried to secure a flapping tarp over his last stack of hay. Hay that was too meager, too pathetic to even feed the livestock he no longer owned. The bank's final notice was a crumpled ball in his pocket, a constant nagging reminder that in 7 days, the man from the territorial bank would arrive with the sheriff and a piece of paper that legally erased Elias from this land. He was a man standing at his own grave, shoveling dirt on himself out of sheer stubborn habit. A sound cut through the gale, a high, thin wail that was almost, but not quite, swallowed by the storm. He tried to ignore it. A dying rabbit, he told himself. The wind whistling through a crack in the barn wall, anything but what it truly is. To acknowledge it was to invite responsibility, and responsibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. It came again, closer this time, clawing its way through the roar of the wind. Desperate, a sound of pure animal terror that was undeniably human. His body went rigid. Every instinct honed by a year of brutal, solitary survival screamed at him to go inside, bolt the door, and wait it out. This was not his problem. The world was full of suffering. He could not save them. He could barely save himself. But his feet, as if with a will of their own, began to move. He trudged through the sucking mud, following the sound around the side of the cabin to the wood pile. He found her there, collapsed against the rough-cut logs, a skeleton wrapped in soaking, threadbare rags. She was so still that for a heart-stopping moment he thought he was too late. Then her head lifted slightly and he saw her face. It was hollowed out by hunger, her skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. Her eyes were enormous, dark pools of sheer, unadulterated terror in their sunken sockets. She was clutching a bundle to her chest, a small, terrifyingly still form wrapped in a sodden shawl. "A child, please," she rasped, her voice the sound of sandpaper on stone, barely audible over the storm. "My boy, he hasn't eaten. 3 days." Elias's mind, sharpened by a long, losing battle with starvation, immediately presented the cold, hard numbers. "I have 1 loaf of bread left. 1, that's my food for the next 2 days." If I give it away, I am choosing to starve. This is not my problem. Turn around. Go inside. Survive." He looked past her at his empty barn, its door swinging wildly on a broken hinge. He looked at his fields, now a sea of mud that would bake into concrete under the next day's sun. He was a man who had nothing, a man who was nothing. But then his eyes were dragged back to the boy. He saw the bluish pallor of his skin, the profound, awful stillness that only comes from the body shutting down. It was a stillness he recognized. He had seen it in Sarah's face in her final hours. A slow, inexorable fading that he had been powerless to stop. The memory was of physical pain, a fresh wound ripped open in his soul. He couldn't save his wife, but he could maybe save this child. The internal war was short, violent, and absolute. It was a battle between the man he had become, hard, empty, focused only on the next breath, and the man Sarah had believed him to be. Cursing his own sentimentality, his own stupid soft heart that had doomed him to poverty and was now dooming him to death, he knelt. The mud soaked through his worn trousers, cold and final. "Come on," he grunted, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He reached out, his hands surprisingly gentle, and scooped up the boy. The child was frighteningly light, a bundle of bones and damp cloth offering no resistance. The woman, Anya, stumbled to her feet, using the woodpile for support, a flicker of wild, disbelieving hope in her sunken eyes. That hope, he realized, was more terrifying than her despair. Inside the cramped, damp cabin, the world shrank to the space around the hearth. He laid the boy, Liam, on his own cot, pulling the thin, patched blanket over him. He stoked the feeble fire, pouring his last few pieces of split wood onto it, a reckless expenditure of his last resources. The room began to warm, the firelight dancing on the walls and illuminating the depth of their suffering. And then he did it. He walked to the pantry, a bare shelf holding a few tin cans and a burlap sack, and took down the last hard loaf of bread, the one he had baked with the final handful of flour, the one that represented his own continued existence for 2 more days. It was dense, dark, and unappealing, but it was life. He held it in his hands, feeling its solid weight. This was the line. Once he crossed it, there was no going back. He looked at the loaf, then at the woman shivering by the fire, then at the deathly still child on his bed. With a decisive crack that seemed to echo in the small room, he broke the loaf in 2. He gave the larger half to Anya. She took it with trembling, skeletal hands, her eyes flooding with tears she was too dehydrated to shed. She didn't devour it. She ate it slowly, reverently, each tiny bite a monumental event, her body trembling with the effort of restraint. Elias took the other half and crumbled it into a tin cup of warm water he had heating on the stove, making a thin, gruel-like paste. He sat on the edge of the cot, dipping a finger into the paste and carefully rubbing it onto Liam's lips. At first, there was no response. The boy's face was a mask of waxen stillness. A cold dread gripped Elias's heart. Had it been for nothing? He tried again, gently prying the small mouth open and letting a few drops of the paste trickle inside. He waited. A second passed, then another, and then a miracle, a faint, weak swallow, a tiny, almost imperceptible suckling reflex. Life, stubborn and fragile, began to trickle back into the small body. A soft sigh escaped Anya's lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Elias knew he had just signed his own death warrant. He had traded his last 2 days of life for theirs. He was now a man with no food, no hope, and no future. But as he watched the faint pink slowly return to Liam's cheeks, a profound and inexplicable peace settled over him. It was the peace of a man who had finally, after years of futile struggle, chosen something that mattered infinitely more than his own survival. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like a human being. He had no way of knowing that his single, simple act of mercy had just made him the primary enemy of the most ruthless man in the territory. He had given his last bread to Jared Silas's runaway wife, and the only heir to a stolen, blood-soaked empire. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming for him at dawn. The fragile peace inside the cabin was a lie, and Elias knew it. The storm outside had ended, but the one brewing in his chest was just beginning. He watched Anya as she tended to Liam, her movements slowly gaining a ghost of their former grace. The food had worked a miracle, but it was a temporary one. The boy was still dangerously weak, and the woman's eyes held a haunted, skittish quality, like a deer that knows the hunter is still in the woods. He needed answers. The kind of trouble that could bring 150 men to your door didn't come from simple vagrancy. "Anya," he said, his voice low so as not to startle her. She flinched anyway, her head snapping up. "The man who's after you. Who is he?" The name, when she finally whispered it, landed in the small cabin with the weight of a tombstone. "Silas, Jared Silas." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Silas wasn't a man, he was an institution of terror. He owned the mines to the north, the grazing land to the south, and the sheriff by all accounts. He was a land baron who expanded his empire not through purchase, but through pressure, intimidation, and the mysterious disappearance of anyone who stood in his way. "He's my husband," Anya said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. The story spilled out of her then, in fits and starts, punctuated by her fearful glances at the door and windows. She wasn't just a runaway wife. She was a prisoner who had escaped. Her family, the Millers, had owned a prosperous farm bordering Silas's original claim. They had a spring, a rare year-round source of fresh water. Silas wanted it. Her father refused to sell. A week later, a raging barn fire took her parents and her older brother. The official report called it a tragedy, a kicked-over lantern. But Anya knew. She had seen 2 of Silas's men skulking near the property that evening. "Silas came to me after the funeral," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was so solicitous, he offered his protection. I was 17, alone and terrified. I had no one." Her hands twisted in the fabric of her ragged dress. The marriage was a business transaction. He got the land, the water, and a pretty young wife to cement his claim to legitimacy. I got a gilded cage. For a few years, she played her part. Then Liam was born. At first, Jared was pleased, an heir. But as Liam grew, she looked at her son, her expression a mixture of fierce love and profound sorrow. "He's a gentle boy. He cries when the field hands have to put down a sick animal. He shares his sweets with the kitchen maid's children. Jared. He sees that kindness as a disease, a weakness that would destroy everything he's built." The real horror began 6 months ago. Silas started talking about hardening the boy. He mentioned a brutal military academy back east, a place known for breaking spirits. Then, 2 nights ago, Anya had been passing by his study door. She heard him speaking with his chief enforcer, a man named Kane. "The boy is a liability," Jared said. Anya's voice dropped to a terrified whisper, mimicking her husband's cold tone. "If he cannot be remade, he must be removed. An accident. Like the Millers' clean, final..." Elias felt a cold fury ignite in his gut. He was no stranger to hardship, but this was a different kind of evil. Calculating, paternal, and utterly soulless. "That's when I knew I had to run," Anya said, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "But I couldn't just run. I needed something to protect us, something to stop him." She had stolen into his study after he'd fallen into a drunken sleep. In a hidden compartment in his desk, she found it. A ledger, but not of money. It was a record of his crimes. Names, dates, amounts paid for services rendered. Arsons, beatings, even 2 names with a single chilling word next to them. Disappeared. It listed sheriffs and judges who were on his payroll. It was his reckoning book, the key to his entire corrupt empire. "I took it," Anya said, her jaw tightening with a sliver of defiance. "It was the only weapon I had. He isn't just hunting me for leaving him. He's hunting me because I stole his soul, and he will burn down the world to get it back." Elias stared at her, the full, catastrophic scale of his situation finally dawning on him. He wasn't just sheltering a woman and child. He was sitting on a powder keg that could blow up the entire territory. The reckoning book was their only shield, and it made them the biggest target imaginable. The first complication announced itself with 3 sharp, authoritative raps on the cabin door. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. Anya gasped, clamping a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her eyes widened in pure, undiluted terror. Liam stirred in his sleep. "Elias Vance. Open up, sheriff's business." It was Sheriff Roy Miller's voice. Anya's cousin by marriage, "Silas's man, the root cellar. Now!" Elias hissed, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He practically shoved them toward the trap door, helping Anya down with Liam in her arms. "Not a sound," he whispered fiercely before slamming it shut and dragging the worn rug back over it. He took a deep breath, willing his pulse to slow. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the 2 empty bowls on the table by the fire. "Stupid!" He snatched them up and shoved them into a cupboard. He then picked up his wood-whittling knife and a half-finished bird figure, forcing his hands to move to look casual. He opened the door to find Sheriff Miller standing there, his bulky frame blocking the morning light. He wasn't alone. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting casually on their pistol butts. Miller's eyes, small and shrewd, immediately began scanning the single room behind Elias. "Mornin', Roy," Elias said, leaning against the doorframe, trying to look bored. "What brings you all the way out here?" "We're looking for someone, Elias," Miller said, not bothering with pleasantries. "A woman, Anya Silas, and her boy. They're runaways. Stole valuable property from her husband. You seen them?" Elias forced a dry, humorless laugh. "In that storm last night? Roy, I was lucky to keep my own roof on. Haven't seen a soul." He held up the whittling knife. "Just me and the chipmunks." Miller's gaze was like a physical pressure. It swept over the room, lingering on the hearth, where the fire was still a little too robust for a man who claimed to have been hunkered down alone. It lingered on the floor near the rug, where a single, small, muddy footprint, Liam's, was faintly visible. "That so?" Miller said, his voice dripping with skepticism. He took a step forward, forcing Elias to give ground. The sheriff's eyes fell on the rug. It was slightly crooked. "Funny. We found a torn piece of cloth snagged on a fence post about a mile east of here. Looks like it came from a woman's dress. Headed straight this way." Elias's mind raced. Bluff? Or had they really found a clue? "Like I said, Roy, I didn't see anyone." One of the deputies, a younger man with a cruel twist to his mouth, spoke up. "Place seems awfully warm for a man who's been alone. And that's a lot of wood you've burned." Elias met the deputy's gaze, letting a little of his own hardness show. "It was a cold night. I like to be warm." "That a crime now?" Sheriff Miller took another slow step into the room, his eyes locked on the trap door under the rug. The air grew thick with unspoken threat. Elias calculated the distance to his rifle leaning in the corner. It was too far. "Thing is, Elias," Miller said softly, stopping right next to the rug, "Jared Silas is a powerful man, and he's mighty upset. He's offering a substantial reward for the return of his family. And let's just say he's less than forgiving to those who get in his way." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Now I'm gonna ask you one more time. Have you seen Anya Silas and her boy?" In that moment, Elias knew that Miller knew. He could see it in the man's cold, confident eyes. This wasn't an inquiry. It was a test, and Elias was about to fail. From beneath their feet, through the floorboards, came a sound, a faint, muffled cough. It was Liam. The sound was small, weak, but in the dead silence of the cabin, it was as loud as a cannon shot. Sheriff Miller's face broke into a slow, ugly smile. He never took his eyes off Elias. "Well now," he purred. "Sounds like you've got mice, Elias. The game was up." The first complication had just become a full-blown catastrophe. This is a fantastic scene, full of incredible tension and defiance. Elias's desperate courage in the face of absolute power, and Anya's heartbreaking move to save him, raised the stakes perfectly for the final confrontation. I've added the pauses to emphasize the slow-motion dread of the sheriff's confirmation, and the chilling intimacy of Silas's final approach. Time stopped. The faint, muffled cough from beneath the floorboards hung in the air, a tiny, devastating bomb that shattered the fragile pretense. Sheriff Roy Miller's smile was a thin, cruel slash on his face. He didn't look at the rug. He kept his eyes locked on Elias, the way a predator watches its prey just before the strike. "Mice," Miller repeated, the word dripping with mockery. "Big ones by the sound of it." He took a deliberate step toward the trap door. Elias's body moved before his mind could form a coherent thought. He shifted, placing himself squarely between the sheriff and the rug, his hand instinctively drifting toward the wood-whittling knife still in his grip. It was a pathetic weapon against 3 armed men, but it was all he had. That's far enough. "Roy," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous, losing all pretense of civility. The two deputies behind Miller stiffened, their hands going to their pistols. The cabin, which had felt so small moments before, now felt like a shrinking arena. Miller stopped, his smile widening. "Or what, Elias? You gonna carve me a new badge? You're in over your head, farmer. This isn't about a few stolen chickens. You're harboring fugitives from Jared Silas. You might as well be spitting into a hurricane." He gestured with his head toward the door. "Now step aside. Let's be civil about this. I take the woman and the boy, and you can go back to whatever it is you do out here." "They're not fugitives," Elias snarled, the fury he'd felt listening to Anya's story boiling over. "She's running from a man who threatened to murder his own son. Your own kin, Roy. Or have you forgotten that?" A flicker of something, shame, anger, passed behind Miller's eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by hardened resolve. "I don't know what stories she's been spinning, but my duty is to the law. And the law says she's his property, and that boy is his heir. Now, for the last time, step aside." The standoff stretched, thick with the promise of violence. Elias knew he couldn't win a fight, but he also knew he couldn't let them take Anya and Liam. To do so was to deliver them to their deaths. He was trapped, cornered by his own decency. It was the sound that saved him from having to make a suicidal choice. A new sound, distant but growing fast. Not the wind, not a single rider. It was a low, rolling thunder. The kind that didn't come from the sky but from the earth. The kind made by countless hooves pounding the hard-packed ground in unison. Everyone in the cabin froze. Miller's smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a wary tension. He and his deputies exchanged glances. This was not part of their plan. Elias felt a fresh, deeper dread wash over him. He knew with a sickening certainty what that sound was. The main event had arrived. Miller moved to the window, peering out through the grimy glass. His face went pale. "Hell's bells," he muttered. Elias joined him at the window. The sight that met his eyes was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. A wall of riders was cresting the eastern ridge, flowing down into the valley like a tide of darkness. They moved with a terrifying, disciplined silence, fanning out with the precision of a well-oiled machine. 150 men. They encircled the farm completely, a noose of men and horseflesh that tightened with every passing second. At their head, riding a jet-black stallion that seemed to absorb the morning light, was Jared Silas. Even from this distance, his presence was a cold weight. He sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. But his gaze was fixed on the cabin with the intensity of a hawk sighting a mouse. The sheriff's authority, which had felt so absolute moments ago, suddenly seemed laughably small. He was a minnow in a pond that had just been invaded by a shark. "Well," Miller said, his voice slightly unsteady, "looks like you get to deliver your guests in person, Elias." The three lawmen, their confrontation with Elias forgotten, filed out onto the porch, their hands held up in a non-threatening manner toward the army now surrounding them. Elias followed, his heart a frantic drum in his chest. The silence was absolute. 150 men, and the only sounds were the jingle of bits, the creak of leather, and the soft snorting of horses. It was more intimidating than any shouted threat. Jared Silas nudged his horse forward a few steps. He ignored Elias completely. His eyes were on Sheriff Miller. "Roy," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried with a crisp, cutting clarity. "I trust you have located my property." Miller swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "We have, Jared, they're inside." Vance here was reluctant to cooperate. Silas's gaze finally shifted to Elias. It was like being stared at by a glacier. There was no anger, no hatred, just a cold, analytical assessment, as if Elias were a piece of machinery that had malfunctioned. "Elias Vance," Silas said, as if reading from a ledger, "owner of this plot of dust, deeply in debt to the territorial bank, 7 days from foreclosure." He paused, letting the humiliation sink in. "You have something that belongs to me. 2 somethings, in fact. And you have something else. A book, so he knew about the reckoning book. Of course he did. Anya had been right. It was the real prize. They're not your property," Elias said, his voice stronger than he expected. "They're people, and the boy is your son." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Silas's lips. Sentimentality, the currency of failures. He looked back at Miller. "Sheriff, secure my wife and son. And the book." Miller nodded, turning back toward the cabin with his deputies. "No." Elias moved to block the door again, desperation overriding his fear. "You can't. He'll kill them." He said it himself. Silas's patience, a thin veneer at best, evaporated. His eyes turned as cold and hard as chips of flint. "I've tolerated this theater long enough." He raised his gloved hand. In a single fluid, synchronized motion, 150 rifles were raised and aimed at Elias Vance's chest. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Elias could see the dark, circular muzzles of the guns, could feel the collective intent to kill radiating from the circle of men. This was it. He was going to die on his own porch for a woman and a child he'd known for less than a day. "The next word you speak," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "will be your last." "Move away from the door." Elias stood his ground. He thought of Anya's terror, of Liam's innocence, of Sarah's memory. Dying for them felt like the first truly meaningful thing he had done in years. He closed his eyes, waiting for the blast. But the blast didn't come. Instead, a new sound broke the silence. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Elias spun around. Anya stood there, her face pale but resolute. She had pulled the rug aside and opened the trap door. She held Liam tightly with one arm, and in her other hand she held a small leather-bound ledger. She had given herself up. "Stop," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent army. She looked not at the sheriff, but directly at her husband. "It's me you want, Jared. Let Elias go." He was just trying to help. Silas's eyes locked onto the book in her hand. A flicker of raw, avaricious hunger crossed his face before he controlled it. "Anya, you've caused a great deal of trouble. Come here now, and if I do?" she challenged, a spark of her former defiance returning. "What happens to him?" She nodded toward Elias. "The farmer is irrelevant," Silas said dismissively. "He will be dealt with according to the law." He glanced at Sheriff Miller, who gave a grim nod. The meaning was clear. Elias would be shot while resisting arrest. Anya's shoulders slumped. She had lost. She had traded their hiding place for nothing. She took a hesitant step forward, but Elias put a hand on her arm, stopping her. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. He looked at Silas. "You want the book? Then you deal with me." A ripple of surprise went through the riders. No one talked to Jared Silas like that. Silas's eyes narrowed. "You have nothing to bargain with, farmer." "I have this," Elias said, gesturing to Anya and the book. "You send your men in here, there's going to be a fight. People get hurt. Maybe the book gets torn, pages lost, or maybe it gets burned." He looked Silas dead in the eye. "You want it clean. You want it safe? Then you and I talk. Alone, man to man." It was a bluff of monumental proportions. He had no power here, but he was betting everything on Silas's obsessive control and his desire for that book to be intact. The silence stretched for an eternity. The entire valley waited on Silas's verdict. He studied Elias, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Cain," he said. Without turning his head, a massive man, built like a brick wall and with a face that looked like it had been used to break rocks, dismounted and walked forward. He was Silas's chief enforcer, the man Anya had overheard. "Disarm the farmer." Then everyone, including the sheriff, pulls back to the tree line, Silas ordered. "No one approaches this cabin until I say so." Cain walked up to Elias, his eyes flat and dead. He roughly took the whittling knife from Elias's belt, then patted him down for any other weapons. Finding none, he gave a grunt of disdain and walked back to his horse. Slowly, reluctantly, the circle of riders began to pull back, moving 100 yards away to the edge of the property. Sheriff Miller and his deputies mounted up and joined them. Their expressions a mixture of relief and frustration. In minutes, the yard was empty save for Jared Silas still on his horse, and Elias Vance, standing on his porch with Anya and Liam behind him. The siege had not ended. It had become infinitely more personal. Silas dismounted. He walked toward the porch, his boots making no sound in the dust. He stopped at the bottom step, looking up at Elias. "All right, farmer," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You have my attention. Now, let's talk about the price of your interference. The space between them was only 10 feet, but it felt like a chasm separating two different worlds. On one side stood Jared Silas, embodiment of power, wealth, and absolute control, his polished boots planted in the dust of a world he considered his to own. On the other stood Elias Vance, a man who owned nothing but his own stubborn defiance, his worn work boots rooted on the porch of the only thing he had left. Silas's gaze was like a physical pressure, but Elias refused to look away. He could feel Anya trembling behind him, her breath a shallow, frightened whisper. He could feel the weight of the reckoning book in her hand, a tangible representation of the evil standing before them. "You have my attention," Silas repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "A commodity you will find is exceedingly brief. Speak." Elias's mind raced, a frantic search for leverage where there was none. He had bluffed his way into this moment, and now he had to make the bluff real. He had to speak Silas's language, the language of deals and power. "The book," Elias began, his voice rough but steady. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not her. Not the boy. This." He gestured to the ledger in Anya's hand. Silas's eyes flickered to the book, a predator's focus. "It is my property." "It's a list of your sins," Elias countered. "And you're terrified of it." A muscle in Silas's jaw twitched. "I'm terrified of nothing. I am inconvenienced." "Now your proposal, farmer?" "Before my patience expires," Elias took a deep breath. "This was the gamble. You want it clean? You want it safe? Then you let them go. You give Anya and Liam a horse, provisions, and a 24-hour head start. You call off your dogs. You let them disappear, and in return?" Silas asked, his tone dripping with contemptuous amusement. "In return," Elias said, "I give you the book. Once they're safe, and I give you my silence." Silas actually laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. "Your silence? Your silence is worth less than the dirt I'm standing on. You are a ghost, Vance, a man who has already ceased to exist. I could have my men turn you into a stain on this porch, take the book and retrieve my property before noon. Why would I possibly agree to this?" "Because you're a businessman, not a butcher," Elias said, repeating his earlier thought, praying it was true. "A stain on my porch is messy. It raises questions. A man and a woman and a child riding away. That's a family moving on. It's quiet. It's clean. And you get what you want without a single shot being fired in front of 150 witnesses, some of whom might eventually start to talk." He was appealing to Silas's obsession with control, with the pristine, bloodless facade of his power. "And what is to stop me?" Silas said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "From agreeing, taking the book, and then hunting them down tomorrow? Or next week? What is to stop me from having you hanged for theft the moment they are out of sight?" "Nothing," Elias admitted, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "Nothing but your word." "My word," Silas sneered. "To a bankrupt farmer?" "No," Elias said, a new idea, a desperate final card forming in his mind. "Not to me." He turned slightly, his eyes meeting Anya's. They were wide with fear, but he saw a core of steel there. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked back at Silas. "Your word to her," Elias said, his voice gaining a strange, powerful conviction. "You stand here, in front of this cabin, in front of me, and you swear to your wife that if she gives you the book, you will let her and your son go. You will grant them their freedom. You swear it on the one thing I believe you might actually care about." "And what, pray tell, is that?" Silas asked, his curiosity momentarily overpowering his contempt. "Your empire," Elias said softly. "You swear it on your legacy, on all that you've built." The air crackled with tension. It was an insane, audacious demand, to ask a man like Silas to swear an oath on the very thing he had killed for. Silas was silent for a long time, his cold eyes studying Elias as if seeing him for the first time. He wasn't looking at a simple farmer anymore. He was looking at a man who understood the value of symbols, of honor, even in a heart that had none. He saw a man who was not afraid to die for a principle, and that made him unpredictable, dangerous. Elias pressed his advantage, the only one he had. "It's the only way you get the book intact, Silas. You make that oath, she hands it to you. You break your word, and everyone will know that Jared Silas's legacy is built on a lie he told his own wife. That his word is worthless. That everything he has can be taken away by a piece of paper. How long do you think your empire lasts then? How long before the men you've bribed and bullied decide you're not a god? Just a man who can't keep a promise. It was a threat woven from the thinnest of threads, but it was the only thread Elias had. He was betting Silas's monstrous ego against his monstrous greed. Slowly, deliberately, Jared Silas turned his gaze to his wife. The hatred and possession in his eyes were palpable. He needed that book. It was the bedrock of his power, the key to controlling the men who served him. The idea of it being loose in the world, of its contents being known, was a threat he could not tolerate. "Very well," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. He looked at Anya, his expression unreadable. "You have my word. Give me the book. Take a horse from my men. You and the boy have 24 hours. After that, if I ever see you again, I will not be so forgiving." The promise hung in the air, a cold, fragile thing. Did he mean it? Or was it just another lie? Anya looked from her husband's face to Elias's. In Elias's eyes, she saw only grim determination and a faint, desperate hope. It was more than her husband had ever offered her. It was a chance. Her hands trembled as she held out the small, leather-bound ledger. For a moment, no one moved. It was the transfer of a kingdom. The fate of 3 lives balanced on the edge of a promise made by a man who had never kept one in his life. Silas took a final step forward and plucked the book from her grasp. His fingers closed around it, and a visible wave of relief and triumph washed over him. He had won. He had his empire back, secure and unchallenged. He tucked the book inside his coat, a smug, victorious smile finally gracing his lips. He looked at Elias. "You see, farmer?" he said. "In the end, it is always about power. You had a momentary flicker of it, but now," he shrugged, "now you have nothing." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with easy grace. He didn't look back at Anya or his son. They were already erased from his ledger. He rode toward his men who parted for him. He gave a signal, and one of the riders detached a single, sturdy-looking mare and led it toward the cabin, tying its reins to the porch post. A canteen of water and a small sack of provisions were already tied to the saddle. The army of riders then turned as one and began to move away, following their master back over the ridge from which they had come. Within minutes, the valley was empty, silent save for the sigh of the wind. The confrontation was over. The nonviolent resolution had been achieved. Promise had been made. Elias stood on the porch watching them go, a profound exhaustion settling into his bones. He had done it. He had stared down the devil and won. Anya stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears of relief and a sorrowful gratitude. "You did it, Elias. You saved us." But as Elias watched the last of the riders disappear, a cold dread began to seep into the place where his triumph had been. He looked at the lone horse, at the vast empty landscape. He looked at Anya's hopeful, trusting face. He had secured their freedom with the word of a man who had none, and he was now utterly alone with the chilling certainty that Jared Silas had no intention of honoring his oath. The real battle for their lives was just beginning, and it would start the moment they rode out of sight of this cabin. The climax had passed, but the danger was far from over. The silence they left behind was deafening. The dust settled over the yard, erasing the tracks of 150 horses, but the ghost of their presence remained, a chilling mist that clung to the barren land. Elias stood on the porch, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline and a dawning, terrible realization. He had won the battle, but he had likely lost the war. Anya stood beside him, her hand resting on Liam's shoulder. The boy looked up at Elias with wide, trusting eyes. "He's gone," Liam whispered, as if saying it louder would make it less true. "For now," Elias said, his voice gravelly. He turned to Anya, his expression grim. "We need to move now." He gave his word, but a man like Silas, his word is only good until it's not. He'll have riders waiting. The second you're out of sight of this valley, they'll take you. Anya's hope, so bright moments before, flickered and died. Then it was for nothing? The book. "Your bravery." "No," Elias said, a new, fierce light igniting in his own eyes. "It bought us time, and it gave me an idea." He looked toward the ridge where Silas had disappeared. He thinks he's won. He thinks he's safe. But he made one mistake. What? Anya asked, desperation edging her voice. He showed his hand, Elias said. He brought an army to my door for a book. That doesn't just tell me the book is valuable. It tells every one of those 150 men that the book is valuable. And men talk. He moved quickly, his mind racing ahead. The horse stays. You're not taking it. But how will we? You're not leaving, Elias interrupted. Not yet. Not like he expects. He led them back inside the cabin and went straight to the root cellar, pulling up the trap door. Get in. Elias, what are you doing? Anya asked, confused. The one place they won't look twice, he said, his voice urgent. He just saw you come out of here. He thinks it's empty now. It's the last place his men will search when they come back. Understanding dawned on Anya's face. It was a desperate, brutal gamble, to hide in the very hole they had just been discovered in. And what will you do? She asked, clutching Liam tighter. Elias's gaze was steely. I'm going to make sure his word is the only thing that gets broken today. He helped them down into the dark, damp space and closed the trap door, throwing the rug back over it. He then took the lone horse Silas had left, led it into his dilapidated barn, and hid it in a rear stall covered with old canvas. Then, he waited. He didn't have to wait long. An hour later, just as he predicted, he heard the sound of approaching riders. Not an army this time. A small, fast group, 4 men led by the hulking enforcer, Cain. They rode into the yard with casual arrogance, expecting no resistance. Elias met them on the porch, his arms crossed. He said nothing. Cain dismounted, a cruel smirk on his face. The boss had a change of heart. Thinks maybe the woman left something else behind. We're here to search the place. You have my permission, Elias said, his voice flat. But you won't find them. They're long gone, Cain snorted and gestured to his men. They pushed past Elias and entered the cabin. He heard the sounds of them overturning his meager possessions. The cot, the cupboard. It was violent, disrespectful, and thorough. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering, praying the root cellar would escape their notice. After 10 minutes, the men filed out. One of them kicked idly at the rug over the trap door, but didn't bother to lift it. Why would they? They had just seen the quarry flee from it. Nothing, one of them reported to Cain. Cain turned his predatory gaze on Elias. Which way did they go? Elias met his stare. I don't know. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Cain took a step forward, his massive frame looming over Elias. You've got a mouth on you for a dead man. The only reason you're still breathing is because the boss finds you amusing. But his amusement don't last long. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of tobacco. We'll find them. And when we do, I'll make sure you get the news. With that, he turned, mounted his horse, and the 4 riders galloped away, heading east. Down the presumed escape route, Elias didn't move until the sound of their hooves had completely faded. Then, his legs feeling weak, he stumbled back inside and yanked open the trap door. Anya and Liam climbed out, pale and shaken. They're gone, Elias breathed. They took the bait. For the first time, a genuine, untainted hope blossomed on Anya's face. They had survived the first test, but Elias's plan was only beginning. Now we use the time he's given us, he said. We don't run. We fight. Fight? Anya asked, bewildered. Elias, we have nothing. No army, no weapons. We have the truth, Elias said, a grim smile touching his lips. And we have a name. Judge William Harding. Anya's eyes widened. The federal circuit judge? He's in the book. Silas owns him. He thinks he owns him, Elias corrected. But men like Harding, they're only loyal to power. The second a bigger power appears, their loyalty shifts. He looked at Anya intently. You read the book. You know what was in it. Not just the crimes, but the payments. The amounts, the dates. Do you remember? For Harding? Anya closed her eyes, concentrating. The terror of the last day fell away, replaced by the sharp, focused intelligence that had allowed her to survive Silas for so long. Yes, she said, her eyes snapping open. I remember. $500, last spring. For a land ruling against the Dawson family. Elias felt a surge of triumph. That's our weapon. The book is gone, but the knowledge isn't. We can't prove it, but we can scare Harding with it. We make him think we have copies. We make him think Silas is finished. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Elias did not go to the local sheriff or the corrupt territorial marshal. He went to the one person in the territory who was too stubborn, too ornery, and too independent to be on Silas's payroll, Old Man Henderson, who ran the remote telegraph office. He was also Anya's distant uncle, a fact she had forgotten in her years of isolation. Using the last of his credit and calling in a years-old favor, Elias sent a carefully worded telegram to Judge Harding's chambers in the territorial capital. It contained no accusation, only a simple, chilling message. The reckoning book is copied. The Dawson payment of $500 is known. Silas's protection is over. The bearer of this truth comes to you next. Justice or ruin, your choice. It was a blast fired into the dark, a desperate hope that the judge's self-preservation would outweigh his loyalty. Then, they waited again, hiding in the cabin, jumping at every sound. The reply came not by wire, but by a lone, dust-covered rider who arrived at dusk the next day. He was a U.S. Marshal, his badge gleaming in the fading light. He carried a warrant for the arrest of Jared Silas for conspiracy, corruption, and murder, based on new evidence presented to a federal judge. Jared Silas, confident in his victory and the safety of his ledger, was arrested at his own dinner table that very night. His empire, built on fear and a little black book, crumbled in a single silent moment. The men who had followed him out of fear abandoned him overnight. The reckoning book, the very thing he had sought to protect, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. A week later, Elias stood on his porch once more. The land was still dusty, the cabin still crumbling, but the air felt different. It felt free. Anya and Liam stood beside him. They were not leaving. The federal marshal, recognizing her courage and her key role in bringing down Silas, had granted her official protection and the return of her family's original land, the land with the freshwater spring that had started it all. "The bank," Elias said, looking out at his fields. "They'll be coming tomorrow." Anya placed a hand on his arm. "No, they won't." She smiled, a true radiant smile that erased years of hardship from her face. The first thing the marshal did was freeze all of Silas's assets, including his holdings in the territorial bank. "Your debt was to him, Elias, not the bank. The note is void. The land is yours, free and clear." The words didn't register at first. Then the weight of a lifetime of failure and debt lifted from his shoulders so suddenly, he felt lightheaded. He looked at his land, his free land, and the ghost of Sarah seemed to smile in the rustling leaves of the cottonwood tree she had planted. He had given his last bread, and in return, he had received back his life, his land, and a new family forged in the crucible of shared courage. Anya and Liam stayed. The Mercer farm and the Miller land were worked together, a partnership built on respect and a bond that was stronger than blood. The bridge Elias had built with a single act of compassion became a permanent pathway to a future none of them had dared to dream of. Liam, no longer haunted by the shadow of a monstrous father, grew into the kind, strong man his mother always knew he could be. And Elias Vance, the broken farmer, became a legend, not for his wealth or his power, but for the day he stared down an army with nothing but a loaf of bread and the unshakable conviction that some things are worth dying for. The world will tell you that you are too small to make a difference, that your resources are too meager, your voice too quiet. But history is not written by the powerful alone. It is written in the quiet, defiant moments when a broken man offers his last bread, when a terrified woman remembers a number, when simple courage throws a stone that brings down a giant. Never underestimate the power of a single act of compassion. It is a seed that, when planted in the dust of despair, can grow a forest of hope. If you were in Elias's shoes, with one loaf of bread left and a starving family at your door, would you have the courage to give it away? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story of one man's ultimate sacrifice against impossible odds gripped you, then you need to see the video on your screen right now. It's another unforgettable tale where a single choice changes everything. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, because history's greatest stories of courage are waiting for you.